Court records from the old Oklahoma Territory mention her almost reluctantly. No grand descriptions, no dramatic language, just a name that made plantation owners lower their voices and change the subject. Sarah Granger. Across 3 counties, that name was spoken like a warning. She stood trial not once, but 4 separate times between 1847 and 1856, always on nearly the same charge, grievous assault upon the person of her lawful master. Each time she faced a jury, the judge cleared the courtroom of women and children before testimony began. Each time the evidence against her was detailed, graphic, and overwhelming, and each time no jury would convict her. Her attacks were not wild or impulsive. They were targeted, precise, designed to maim in ways that could never be undone. 3 men were left unable to father children. The 4th lost something less visible, but just as permanent. His sanity, according to those who knew him. Officially, the record spoke of trauma requiring medical intervention. Off the record, people said his mind simply never came back. Everyone in authority knew what Sarah had done. The community knew. The courts knew. Yet somehow, again and again, the system that executed enslaved people for far less let her go. Before we go deeper into Sarah Granger's story, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, stories dragged out of forgotten court ledgers and sealed archives, don't surface often. And tell me in the comments which city or state you're watching from. I want to know exactly where these buried histories are traveling. Now, let's look at how a woman like Sarah Granger came to exist in a world designed to break her. People who met her never forgot her. But it wasn't because she looked like a threat. She stood just over 5 feet tall, with small, careful hands that looked too delicate for the brutal work of the cotton fields. A single thin scar ran from her left temple down to her jawline, a gift from an overseer's whip when she was 14. The scar was the first thing most people noticed. The second was her eyes. They didn't carry the bowed, distant emptiness expected of an enslaved woman. Her eyes watched, measured, remembered. People described the feeling of being looked through, not at. Sarah was born in 1824 on a tobacco plantation in northern Alabama. Her mother's name never appeared in any ledger. She was a line of property, not a person. Her first owner, Edmund Hartwell, had the reputation of a reasonable man in slaveholding terms. He fed his enslaved workers, punished most harshly when drunk, and occasionally allowed marriages among them, as if basic humanity were a kindness, not a minimum. Sarah's first act of rebellion didn't involve violence. It involved letters. Hartwell's daughter was being taught to read and write in a small schoolroom off the main house. Through a crack in the wall, Sarah watched the girl practice her letters, tracing each shape again and again. Sarah memorized them silently, reconstructing the alphabet in her mind, piecing sounds and symbols together until she could read. In secret, what she learned was illegal, dangerous, and eventually life-saving. In 1842, when Sarah was 18, Hartwell died owing more money than he could ever repay. His assets, land, animals, people, were sold off to cover his gambling debts. Sarah, strong in her prime, and though they didn't know it, literate, fetched a good price, $850. She was bought by a cotton trader named James Wickham, who liked to call her refined when discussing her with other men, as if she were a horse with good lines. The sale tore her away from everything she knew, her mother, her 2 younger brothers, the land where she'd been born. The ledger recorded the transaction. It did not record the grief. The journey west took 6 weeks, chained in a wagon with 11 others. Sarah watched Alabama's green hills flatten into the seemingly endless prairies of what was then called Indian Territory. Officially, the region belonged to displaced native nations, Creek, Cherokee, and others who had already paid their own price in blood and land. Unofficially, white settlers were pushing in, carrying the institution of slavery with them like a virus. Towns like Tahlequah and Fort Gibson were not neat, orderly places. They were collision points: federal law, tribal sovereignty, missionary zeal, and the economics of human bondage smashing into each other every day. And into this unstable landscape, Sarah was delivered. Wickham's plantation sat about 15 miles south of Fort Gibson in what is now Muskogee County. 300 acres of cotton, corn, and tobacco, spread out behind a white house that looked respectable from the road and rotten from within. 42 enslaved men, women, and children lived in 7 cramped cabins behind that house. The man who truly ruled their bodies was not Wickham. It was his overseer. Walter Pewit was a thick-necked Georgian who believed discipline was measured in welts and blood. Talk during work, 20 lashes. Leaving the fields without permission, 30. Lifting a hand to defend yourself, 50 and worse. Every Saturday after sundown, punishment was a public ritual. The entire enslaved community was forced to watch as backs split open and screams tore through the night. A weekly reminder of what defiance cost. Sarah arrived and did something that looked like submission, but wasn't. She kept her literacy hidden. She worked steadily, not too fast to stand out, not too slow to invite attention. She studied people. She discovered who could be trusted and who sold gossip for extra rations. She noticed patterns. Every system has them. She learned that Wickham's wife, Charlotte, rode to Fort Gibson every Tuesday to visit her sister and to refill her laudanum supply. She learned that Wickham himself often visited the cabins on those same Tuesday nights, walking a path he knew well enough to travel without a lantern. She also learned that Pewit preferred the younger women, the ones whose eyes hadn't gone hollow yet. Charlotte Wickham once belonged to a different world. She was a former Charleston belle, daughter of a shipping magnate trained in French and piano. But by 34, childless, dulled by opium and disappointment, she spent her days at a parlor piano, playing the same Chopin nocturne over and over until the house itself seemed tired of hearing it. She knew what her husband did on those Tuesday nights. She simply chose not to care. The first incident happened 5 months after Sarah arrived. On a Tuesday night in late November 1842, the cabin was quiet. Exhausted bodies lay in strained positions on pallets, the air thick with damp wood, smoke, and sweat. When Wickham opened the door, no one moved. This was the unspoken rule. You didn't see, you didn't hear, you didn't know. Survival required a kind of practiced blindness. He didn't bother with a lamp. He knew where Sarah slept. She was awake. She always was on Tuesdays. She could smell him before she clearly saw him. Whiskey, tobacco, and the sharp artificial scent of the pomade in his hair. His shadow loomed over her palate. When his hand landed on her shoulder, Sarah did something most people in her position would never dare. Without flinching, she said quietly, "If you touch me again, I'll kill you." To Wickham it was a joke, a small woman, legally his property, threatening him in the darkness. He laughed softly, almost indulgently, as his hand slid from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, just reminding her that he could. That in the eyes of the law she belonged to him, body and soul. 3 seconds later, everything changed. Sarah's hand came out from under her thin blanket, gripping something metallic. There was a blur of movement, fast, controlled, unhesitating. Wickham made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like a bellows letting out all its air at once, and staggered backward, crashing into the cabin wall. Blood soaked through his trousers with shocking speed. Sarah stood up. She didn't run, didn't scream, didn't attempt to hide what she'd done. She walked past him, stepped into the cold November air, and headed straight for the main house, still holding the cotton knife she'd stolen from the gin house 2 weeks earlier. She'd been preparing for this. On the front porch, she knocked on the door as calmly as if she were delivering a message. Charlotte opened it, eyes hazy from laudanum, still dressed despite the late hour. Her fingers smelled faintly of opium and sheet music. Sarah held the bloody knife out by the handle. "Your husband tried to force himself on me," she said clearly. "I've hurt him badly. He's in cabin 4. He'll need a doctor." Then she sat down on the porch steps and folded her hands in her lap, waiting. The doctor arrived around midnight. Dr. Theodore Gaines rode 14 miles through the dark to attend a man whose wounds he would never fully describe in official language. He found Wickham pale and trembling in the cabin, Charlotte in the parlor downstairs still playing that same nocturne, and Sarah on the porch composed. Silent. The medical record would later describe the injury as severe trauma to the gentleman's person, rendering future marital relations inadvisable. In private, among professionals, Gaines used different words. Sarah had castrated James Wickham with a 3-inch cotton knife, so cleanly and so precisely that at first Gaines assumed someone with surgical training had done it. The blade had removed both testicles in one motion. No hesitation, no clumsy hacking. In his personal journal, he wrote that the cut suggested remarkable anatomical understanding. Wickham lived. He spent 6 weeks confined to his bedroom trying to heal, while Charlotte kept playing those same 16 measures downstairs, a small, repetitive piece of music that now sounded like a funeral march for his manhood. Pewitt ruled the fields in his absence. His punishments grew harsher, his temper shorter, but no one touched Sarah. No one even brushed against her by accident. The law, however, could not simply ignore what she'd done. Under territorial statutes, an enslaved person who struck a master could be executed. An enslaved person who permanently injured a master. Death by hanging was practically automatic, and yet this case was not simple. The nature of the injury, the time of night, the fact that Sarah had walked directly to the main house and surrendered with the weapon in hand, it all made the men in power deeply uncomfortable. Judge Samuel Greenridge, a weary Kentuckian who'd spent 2 decades juggling impossible cases in the legal no-man's land of Indian Territory, found himself facing something he had never quite seen before. Not just a crime, but a moral question that punctured the system he served. He interviewed Sarah privately in the courthouse at Fort Gibson. No official transcript exists, but according to his clerk, she answered every question calmly and plainly. Yes, she had stolen the knife 2 weeks before. Yes, she had done so knowing Wickham would eventually come. Yes, she had known exactly where to cut so the injury would be permanent. No, she did not regret it. When Greenridge asked why she'd chosen that specific punishment instead of killing Wickham outright, she gave him an answer that haunted him. I wanted to make sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. The trial lasted a single day. Wickham did not appear. Officially, his physician said he was too weak to travel. Unofficially, everyone knew he couldn't bear the humiliation of having the nature of his injury read into the record. Pewitt testified that Sarah had always been difficult, that she'd shown signs of insolence. Dr. Gaines described the wound in restrained clinical terms, trying not to look at the jurors' faces as he spoke. Charlotte sat in the gallery, watching everything with a blank, unreadable expression, but never took the stand. Then something no one expected happened. A Creek delegate named William Harjo, representing a nation whose legal traditions still carried weight in the territory, rose to speak. Under Creek law, he argued, Sarah's actions would be considered self-defense against sexual assault. The fact that she was enslaved did not erase her right to protect her body. His participation in the trial was irregular at best, possibly illegal, and absolutely unprecedented. Greenridge let him speak anyway. 12 white men disappeared into the deliberation room with angry plantation owners and anxious lawyers watching every move. 7 hours later, they returned. The verdict was simple, not guilty. The courtroom exploded. Prosecutors shouted for a retrial. Plantation owners wrote furious letters and demanded that something be done to prevent the spread of such ideas among the slave population. A Baptist minister thundered in the local newspaper that acquitting Sarah would lead to chaos and rebellion. Judge Greenridge refused to bend. He let the verdict stand. Wickham wasted no time. He sold Sarah immediately to a widower named Marcus Sheffield, who owned a smaller farm about 30 miles west. The sale price dropped to $600, the difference reflecting what buyers now understood. Sarah Granger came with a warning label. On paper, Sheffield had a reputation as a kinder master. He went to church, allowed occasional wages, and talked about Christian duty and moderation. He believed, as many men did, that what had happened with Wickham wouldn't happen to him. 4 months later, on a different Tuesday night, he discovered exactly how wrong he was. Marcus Sheffield thought he understood what he was buying. On paper, Sarah Granger was a problem. The entire territory knew that now. She had maimed her previous master in a way most men couldn't even bring themselves to picture, much less discuss. But Sheffield believed he was different. He wasn't like Wickham, he told himself. He was a church-going Presbyterian. He paid tithes. He occasionally allowed his workers to earn a few coins for extra tasks. In his mind, that made him reasonable, moral, safe. He looked at Sarah's price, $600, $250 less than Wickham had paid, and decided he was getting a bargain. A strong, proven field worker, and all he had to manage was her temperament. He believed that what had happened on Wickham's plantation was an exception, a strange, unfortunate event brought on by Wickham's drinking and lack of discipline. He didn't understand that what happened next would look almost exactly the same. Sheffield's farm sat 30 miles west of Wickham's land, smaller in scale but built on the same foundation of exploitation. Fewer acres, fewer cabins, fewer enslaved people, but the same unspoken rules, the same hierarchy, the same quiet terror that moved like a shadow through every workday. For 4 months, Sarah did what she'd done before. She kept her literacy a secret. She learned the layout of the farm. She watched who came and went, which doors were locked at night, where keys were kept, what kind of man Marcus Sheffield truly was when the Bible was closed and the sun had gone down. He visited the cabins less often than Wickham had, but the pattern still emerged: a late-night walk, a convenient excuse, a woman with nowhere to go. By then, Sarah had already decided what she would and would not allow. The night it happened, Sheffield told himself the same story Wickham likely had, that this was not really violence, just a man exercising his rights over his property. The law said he could, the society around him affirmed it. The theology he heard from some pulpits excused it. He didn't understand that Sarah no longer accepted any of that. This time she didn't need to steal a cotton knife. She already knew where Sheffield kept his straight razor. Inside a small wooden box near his bed in the main house, the same bed she sometimes had to make during cleaning rotations. She'd found it weeks earlier, testing its edge with a fingertip and filing away the knowledge. When Sheffield pushed into the cabin that night under cover of darkness, he thought he was repeating a familiar script. He wasn't. The details echoed the first incident almost exactly. His looming presence, his hand, his assumption of ownership, until the moment Sarah's hand flashed, fast and certain, the edge of the razor finding exactly what it sought. Not as clean as Wickham's injury, not as catastrophic, but precise enough. When the doctor arrived, once again Dr. Theodore Gaines, summoned to address an intimate trauma no one wanted named, he recognized the pattern immediately. Different man, different house, same woman, same region of the body, same terrifying accuracy. His private journals shifted tone. 3 times now, he wrote, this woman has struck the same part of the male anatomy with uncanny precision. 3 different circumstances, yet one consistent response. This is not madness. This is method. Sheffield, unlike Wickham, retained some physical function. He could walk, work, and speak. But the future he had imagined, remarriage, sons to inherit his land, a family name carried forward, ended that night in a spray of blood and a scream he would never fully admit was fear. The second trial was bigger. People traveled from miles away just to sit in the gallery, to see this small woman whose name now carried rumors wherever it was spoken. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others came because they recognized what the case really represented. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. This wasn't just about Sarah and Sheffield. It was about whether a system built on absolute control could survive a woman who refused to obey the script. This time, Sarah took the stand. Judge Greenridge, against the prosecutor's furious protests, allowed her to testify in her own defense. It was a decision that would echo far beyond his courtroom. For 2 hours, Sarah told the story of her life. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not soften her words to make anyone comfortable. She described being sold away from her mother at 18, her brothers disappearing into the trade like stones dropped into a deep well. She described Wickham's Tuesday night visits in language so clinical and calm that several jurors shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of how much violence their society had normalized. She explained the way women in the cabins learned to become invisible, how they practiced breathing slowly, bodies rigid with terror, pretending to sleep so well that they might as well have been corpses. Then, looking directly at the men in the jury box, she admitted something that made more than one of them flinch. She said that after Wickham, she honestly believed her reputation alone would protect her. I thought, she told them, that once a man knew what I was capable of, he would choose differently. She paused. I was wrong. Sheffield had known exactly what she had done to Wickham. He'd read the court record. He'd discussed the case with his peers. He'd heard the whispers. He had bought her anyway. The prosecutor, a red-faced man named Harrison Tate, who had failed to convict her once already, tried to force her into a corner. He asked if she felt remorse, if she regretted the damage she'd done, if she wished she had chosen a less permanent way to defend herself. Her answer was clear enough to be printed in newspapers as far away as Richmond. "I regret that it was necessary," she said. "I do not regret defending myself. 11 hours. That's how long it took the jury to decide. They argued. They raised their voices. The foreman sent out for more coffee twice, his hand shaking when he signed the note. In the end, they returned the same verdict they had the first time. Not guilty, but this verdict carried something new. Fear. Not of Sarah's hands, but of what she represented. If the law could not or would not punish a woman who mutilated her master for attempting rape, what did that say about the law itself? Sheffield sold her almost immediately. This time, the money exchanged was just $420. Each sale marked her down, not because she was weaker, but because her reputation was stronger. Everyone knew now. Buying Sarah Granger meant gambling with your body. Her third owner, Elias Drummond, thought he saw a way around. That he ran a cotton gin at a small mill near the Canadian River. He employed a handful of enslaved workers and prided himself on being different from the big plantation. Men, he allowed marriages. He permitted small garden plots. He told himself that treating his workers well enough made him safe. He was wrong. Sarah stayed under Drummond's control for 9 months. Months of watching, learning, waiting. 9 months of noticing that kindness and ownership were not opposites. A man could be less cruel and still believe your body was his. When he finally came to her at night, thinking himself immune to the fate of the other two, Sarah responded with the same cold, deliberate logic she'd used before. Not with rage, not with chaos, with precision. This time the weapon was a paring knife from the kitchen, its simple edge sharpened on the millstone until it could cut more cleanly than its makers ever intended. Again the injury was intimate, devastating, and surgically focused. Again Dr. Gaines was called, and again his private notes turned darker. 3 men. He wrote now 3 incidents and 1 constant factor. Sarah Granger. This is no accident. This is a strategy. By now, word had spread far beyond Oklahoma Territory. Abolitionist newspapers in the North wrote about a woman who fought the slave system in the most direct way possible. Pro-slavery editors denounced her as a monster, demanding her immediate execution. Territorial authorities felt humiliated if one assault could be shrugged off as a strange, isolated case. If 2 could be dismissed as a disturbing pattern, 3 was something else. 3, with the same woman at the center, began to look like a blueprint. The third trial drew everything and everyone, curious locals. Planters terrified for their own safety, preachers ready to condemn, lawyers smelling precedent, reporters eager for a story that could be framed as either horror or heroism, depending on the audience. This time, the prosecution came prepared. Tate brought not 1 but 3 doctors to testify about the nature of the injuries. He laid out the pattern in cold detail. 3 masters in succession, 3 late-night visits, 3 attacks aimed at ending male reproductive capability. He painted Sarah as calculating and predatory, a woman who waited for these moments, who wanted to damage these men. He wanted the jury to see her as less than human. It almost worked, but the system had created Sarah, and the system could not outrun what it had made, because when Sarah's defense team stood up, they didn't try to deny what she'd done. They explained why. They reminded the jury of what every honest man in that courtroom already knew, that under slavery, a woman's body was not protected by law, morality, or custom, that visits to the cabins were common, that what had happened to Sarah was not rare. What was rare was her response. And just as before, when the time came to decide, the men in the jury box found themselves staring at a choice far more uncomfortable than guilty or not guilty. They knew the law. They also knew the truth. 15 hours later, they came back and contradicted the law, not guilty. Again this time, something else broke, not Sarah, the system. Because after the third trial, Elias Drummond did something no one expected. He freed her. Official manumission papers filed in December 1851 recorded the decision in cautious legal language. They listed irreconcilable differences in temperament and barred her from returning to Muskogee County. Drummond paid her $75, an entire year's wages for skilled labor, and arranged for her passage to Fort Smith. Arkansas. On paper, it looked like a man disposing of a troublesome asset. In reality, it was something closer to surrender. He wanted distance from Sarah Granger, but he could not erase what she had already done to him, or what she had forced him to see about himself. Sarah arrived in Fort Smith no longer property, but not truly free either. She was a black woman in the 1850s, with a body that had survived slavery and a mind that had outmaneuvered the legal system 3 times. She had no family, no wealth, no safety net. What she did have was something far more dangerous. Time. She rented a small room above a dry goods store and went to work as a seamstress. Needles and thread replaced cotton knives and paring blades. Each dress and coat she finished bought her 1 more day of food, 1 more month of rent. She attended evening classes taught quietly by a Quaker woman who didn't ask questions about why Sarah was so hungry for books and writing. Her literacy, once stolen through cracks in a schoolroom wall, deepened. She became fluent with the written word, not just as a tool of survival, but as a weapon of memory. For 3 years, it looked like the story might end there. A woman who had fought back in ways the law couldn't quite crush, carving out a small, careful life far from the plantations where her name still traveled like bad news. She might have stayed in that room, mending seams and rebuilding herself, but in May 1854, she heard about another woman, 19 years old, no surname recorded, accused of striking her master with a fire poker after he forced his way into her cabin. The man lived, battered and humiliated, claiming he had only gone to check on reports of illness. Hannah, as the records called her, claimed self-defense. Her case was already being twisted into something else by lawyers eager to protect property and reputation. Sarah could have ignored it. She didn't. She walked back across the border into Indian territory, retraced old roads she had once traveled in chains, and returned to the courthouse in Fort Gibson, the same place where she'd been judged 3 times before. This time, she wasn't there as the accused. She came as something new, something the law had no category for. A free black woman asking to testify, not about a crime she'd committed, but about a pattern she'd spent years studying, surviving and now documenting. The men in that courthouse had no idea yet that Sarah hadn't just been defending herself all these years. She had been learning, she had been collecting. She had been building something far more dangerous than fear. She had been building an archive. By the time Sarah Granger stepped into the Fort Gibson courthouse in 1854, the entire room shifted, as if someone had opened a door to a storm. People whispered her name the way others whispered omens, quiet, nervous, unsure whether speaking it too loudly might turn bad luck into reality. Everyone knew why she was there, and yet no one could fully accept it. She had come to defend another woman. Hannah, 19, terrified, nameless in the records, stood accused of striking her master with a fire poker after he forced his way into her cabin. He claimed he'd only come to check on illness. She claimed she'd only defended herself. And Sarah, who had already faced 3 trials and walked away undefeated, now walked into this courtroom as something the system had never seen before. A free black woman acting not as a defendant, but as an expert. The moment the prosecutor, Harrison Tate, saw her, his face tightened. He had failed to convict her 3 times already. The last thing he wanted was her voice influencing another jury. He protested immediately, insisting she had no right to speak. But Sarah, calm as ever, handed Judge Greenridge a bundle of letters tied with a single thread. Letters she had collected secretly for years. Letters from enslaved women in 3 territories, each describing the same pattern of late-night assaults, the same fear, the same silence that the courts pretended did not exist. Greenridge opened the first envelope, and his expression changed instantly. These weren't rumors. These weren't emotional stories. These were documented patterns, dates, injuries, testimonies, all the evidence the law had refused to acknowledge. For the first time, the truth had been placed on the judge's desk in ink, not whispers. When asked what these letters were, Sarah told him plainly that they were 4 years of documentation, women's voices preserved despite every effort to silence them. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't conspiracy. It was testimony written by those who had no legal right to speak. And suddenly the courtroom understood something dangerous. Sarah hadn't been hiding in Fort Smith. She had been studying, collecting, building something far more threatening than a weapon. She was building an archive, an organized memory of everything the system tried to bury. Against Tate's furious objections, Judge Greenridge made a historic decision. He allowed Sarah to testify, not as a witness to Hannah's incident, but as an expert in the patterns of assault enslaved women faced. The prosecution exploded with anger, but the judge was too tired of pretending the law was blind. He wanted the truth recorded. Sarah then spoke to the jury for 3 days. She didn't speak with drama or rage. She spoke with the calm precision of someone who had lived through the patterns she described. She explained how assaults happened, at what hours, under what excuses, and how enslaved women created warning systems to protect each other. She explained anatomy, not to harm but to survive. She explained the difference between panic and self-defense, and she forced the jurors to confront what the law hid behind property rights, that a woman's body was not protected by anything except her own ability to resist. When Tate tried to twist her words, accusing her of teaching women how to mutilate men, Sarah answered with the one sentence that shook the room more than any testimony before it. "I do not teach women how to attack. I teach them how to not be harmed by the men who believe they own them." The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, because everyone knew she was right. After 19 hours of brutal deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, and the moment that verdict was read, the ground shifted across Oklahoma Territory. Women, enslaved, free, native, even white, began seeking Sarah out secretly. They traveled miles at night, risking punishment, because they wanted one thing: knowledge. Knowledge of how to protect themselves, knowledge of what the courts had started to listen to, knowledge of the patterns Sarah had uncovered. And in those quiet meetings, in the shadows behind churches, in whispered conversations inside cabins, a movement began to form, one the territory was not prepared for. Sarah didn't teach rebellion. She didn't teach violence. She taught survival strategy documentation. She taught women what the system refused to teach them, that knowing the truth could be a weapon more powerful than any blade. The men who owned the land and the courts didn't realize it yet. But the moment Sarah testified in defense of Hannah, something irreversible had started. This was not the end of her story. This was not a victory. This was the beginning of a storm, one built not from chaos but from knowledge, patterns, and a woman who refused to let silence win. After Hannah's acquittal, something began to move quietly through Oklahoma Territory. Something subtle, dangerous, and completely invisible to the men who believed they controlled everything. It didn't start with meetings or speeches or rebellion. It started with footsteps in the dark. Women, enslaved, free, native, and even a few white wives trapped in their own silent cages, began seeking Sarah Granger in the same way people search for light when the world goes dark. They came at dusk, at midnight, at dawn, walking through fields, forests, and back roads, pretending to fetch water or visit relatives. They arrived with fear clutched in their throats, but determination in their eyes. And Sarah, sitting in a small rented room above a dry goods store in Fort Gibson, welcomed them with the same quiet composure she brought to every moment of her life. She never asked how they found her. She knew how information traveled among women, through laundries, churches, whispered warnings, letters tucked beneath loose floorboards, and conversations spoken in the few moments when ears weren't listening. Some came trembling, unable to say more than a few words before tears overtook them. Others came with clenched jaws, anger simmering under the surface after years of being violated by men who hid behind the law. Some came because they knew what their masters were planning. Some came because it had already happened. Some came simply because they refused to be next. And Sarah did not turn any of them away. She didn't teach hatred. She didn't encourage retaliation. What she taught was knowledge, cold, precise, survival-focused knowledge. She showed them exactly where danger lived, where men's assumptions blinded them, where a woman's will could interrupt a predator's certainty. She taught them how to position themselves inside a cabin so they could move, how to use small tools, a needle, a carving knife, a broken comb, in ways that could stop a man twice their size. She taught them about nerves, pressure points, and where a precise strike could end an assault instantly. She taught them what words to say in court, what details to remember, how to describe the attack without letting a lawyer twist their story. She warned them that surviving the assault wasn't the end. Surviving the trial was the next battlefield. These were lessons no law book would ever teach, yet these were the lessons women needed just to stay alive. And as Sarah taught, she watched something extraordinary unfold. Fear began to transform into understanding, and understanding into confidence, and confidence into quiet determination. Women left her small room with new posture, eyes sharpened, shoulders steadier. They walked back into a world that wanted them powerless, carrying knowledge the system feared more than any weapon. By early 1855, the consequences began to appear, first as rumors, then as patterns. 9 separate incidents occurred across Oklahoma and Arkansas within 2 years. 9 different plantation owners or overseers attempted the same violation in the same familiar late-night circumstances. And 9 times the women fought back with uncanny accuracy. Some used knives, some used fire pokers, some used tools so small no one could understand how they caused such damage. The injuries varied, but they shared one unmistakable similarity. Each attack aimed at disabling a man's ability to hurt another woman again, doctors whispered. Newspapers speculated. Plantation owners panicked. How could 9 different women, on 9 different properties in 2 different territories, injure men in nearly identical ways? To the powerful, the explanation was unthinkable. They believed their system kept women isolated and ignorant. They believed no black woman could organize anything beyond daily survival. They believed knowledge could not flow among the enslaved, because if knowledge flowed, power flowed, and if power flowed, control slipped. Someone, somewhere, started connecting the patterns. That someone was Sarah Granger. The panic grew so intense that 23 of the wealthiest plantation owners formed what they proudly named the Territorial Property Protection Committee. They met behind closed doors, insisting that these attacks were not coincidences, that someone was teaching women how to disable masters, and that this someone had to be found and punished. Their meetings were filled with fury, humiliation, and fear, disguised as righteous indignation. They needed a target, and they already knew her name. They brought in Cornelius Vance, a lawyer from Richmond, with a reputation for crushing slave resistance through legal manipulation rather than outright violence. He reviewed the 9 incidents, studied Sarah's 3 previous trials, read the newspapers, interviewed terrified plantation owners, and reached one blunt conclusion. Sarah was not simply a woman who fought back. She was the architect of a spreading threat, an idea, and ideas, in the eyes of men like Vance, were far more dangerous than blades. He couldn't try her again for the previous assaults. She'd been acquitted. He couldn't charge her for teaching literacy. She was free now. But he could charge her with something obscure, old and cruel, conspiracy to commit mayhem, a law that didn't require Sarah to injure anyone personally. It only required proof that she had shared knowledge that led others to injure. One night, as women were still traveling to seek her guidance, the knock on Sarah's door was not from someone needing help. It was from men carrying warrants. They seized her journals, her letters, her diagrams, and her years of documentation, the archive she had built so carefully. But what the committee didn't know was that the archive didn't exist in just one place anymore. Sarah had spent months distributing copies and portions of it to churches, tribal leaders, midwives, teachers, and trusted women across multiple territories. Even if they destroyed everything in her room, they could not destroy what she had already set in motion. Still, in 1856, Sarah was arrested and dragged into her 4th trial, the one the powerful believed would end her influence forever. They wanted not justice, not truth, not fairness. They wanted erasure. They wanted silence. They wanted fear restored to the cabins. They wanted the old order back, but what they didn't understand was simple. They were no longer fighting a single woman. They were fighting every woman she had empowered, and by then the fire she had started was already spreading too fast to put out.
When Sarah Granger was arrested in the summer of 1856, Oklahoma Territory reacted the way a frightened animal does when cornered: wild, unpredictable, and determined to crush whatever threatened it. The powerful believed they finally had her, not for assault, Not for defiance, not for anything she had done with her hands. This time, they wanted to bury her for something far more dangerous. What she had taught, what she had documented, what she had shared. The streets outside Fort Gibson's courthouse filled before sunrise. Men in boots and suspenders leaning against posts with arms crossed, their faces set in grim expectation. Plantation owners arrived in wagons and on horseback, whispering to each other like men preparing for battle. Federal marshals guarded the doors, rifles resting against their chests. Inside, the wooden benches overflowed with spectators, people who came to see the woman who had made juries hesitate and made masters fearful in their own homes. And at the center of this storm stood Sarasmal.com, her hands folded as if this was simply another chapter in a life already shaped by conflict. Cornelius Vance, the lawyer brought from Richmond specifically to destroy her, began the trial with a speech meant to shake the room. He didn't waste time accusing Sarah of isolated acts. Instead, he accused her of building a network of resistance. He claimed she had armed women with knowledge. He claimed she had used letters and conversations to coordinate a silent rebellion. Then he lifted the trunk that deputies had seized from her room, a trunk filled with journals, letters, diagrams, and years of documentation. With both hands, he raised it just enough for the jury to see. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is not one woman's story. This is an instruction manual for the destruction of your households." It was not the words themselves that terrified the room, it was the confidence with which he spoke them. He opened the trunk slowly, deliberately, like a man revealing evidence of a crime. One by one, he held up the documents inside. Letters from enslaved women describing late-night assaults. Notes Sarah had taken on the timing and pattern of those attacks. Drawings of nerves and pressure points. Records of trials, verdicts, judges, and testimonies. It was far more organized, far more detailed, far more intelligent than anyone in that courtroom expected a black woman to create. And that was the part that frightened them most. Vance called it conspiracy. He called it orchestrated mayhem. He called it treason in the shadows. But what he really meant was, she understood the system better than the men who built it. Sarah's defense team, 3 young attorneys who believed in ideals bigger than the territory around them, watched the prosecution with growing unease. They knew this wasn't simply a legal argument. This was an attempt to erase a woman whose knowledge challenged the foundation of slaveholding society. And yet, when their leader, Robert Chenoweth, stood before the jury, he didn't try to deny Sarah's intelligence. He didn't try to hide her documentation. He embraced it. "These papers," he said, pointing at the trunk, "are not evidence of conspiracy. They are evidence that the women of this territory have never been protected by law. And so they protected themselves the only way they could, by seeking truth, learning patterns, and refusing to remain silent." The courtroom stirred. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. Even some plantation wives in the gallery lowered their eyes, recognizing the truth behind his words. But the moment that shifted the trial was when Sarah herself rose to testify. At first, Judge Greenridge, frail from illness, yet still carrying the weight of his conscience, but he gave her permission, knowing the law needed to hear her voice at least once without interruption. Sarah walked to the witness stand, not like a criminal, but like a historian standing before her own archive. Her voice never cracked. She never pleaded. She never apologized for surviving. She explained why women wrote to her, how she compiled their stories, why she studied patterns, and how she taught them not to attack, but to defend themselves against the assaults the law refused to acknowledge. And when the prosecutor accused her of planning violence, Sarah gave an answer that cut through the room like a blade through cloth. "I did not plan violence. I prepared for the violence planned against us." The jurors froze. The gallery held its breath. In that moment, everyone understood what the law had never admitted. Violence had always been coming from one direction, and Sarah had simply turned it around. That night, after her testimony, Judge Greenridge collapsed in his chambers. His heart gave out. He died before dawn. But before he died, he wrote one final letter to his daughter in Philadelphia, a letter historians would not discover until decades later. In it, he confessed what no judge of his time could say aloud. "We have built a legal system that protects the powerful from consequence, and condemns the powerless for survival." His last act was an act of truth. The trial continued under Judge William Patterson, a man with none of Greenridge's moral conflict. Patterson rushed the proceedings, dismissing anything that smelled of systemic criticism. Yet the damage was done. Sarah's words had already entered the walls. The truth had already been heard. The jurors, locked in their deliberation room, argued for 4 days, 4 days of raised voices, pacing boots, and sleepless tension. Everyone outside the courthouse waited. Women gathered in prayer circles, planters pacing hotel floors, soldiers watching for riots. Finally, the jury returned, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and shaken by the weight of what they'd confronted. The foreman's voice cracked as he read the verdict, not guilty on all charges. But then came something unprecedented. He unfolded a second sheet of paper, public statement the jury had written together. We cannot criminalize the act of teaching women to protect themselves from assault. We recommend that the territory establish legal protections for enslaved women. The courtroom fell silent, a triumphant silence, not a shocked silence, but a silence so deep it felt like the floor itself had stopped breathing. The powerful men in that room didn't cheer. They understood something terrifying. They had not won, they had not contained her, they had not stopped the movement she represented. Sarah closed her eyes just once in acknowledgement, not in victory, not in relief, but in understanding. She knew something the rest of the territory had not accepted yet. This verdict wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a war the system could no longer hide. Sarah Granger walked out of the courthouse, a free woman for the 4th time. But freedom no longer meant what it once had. The streets outside Fort Gibson buzzed with tension, white men glaring, whispering, spitting tobacco into the dirt, women quietly watching from behind shutters, soldiers tightening their grips on rifles as if expecting violence to burst from the air itself. But nothing erupted, nothing burned, nothing collapsed. The danger was quieter, subtler. It was the anger of a system that had failed publicly and now sought a quieter form of revenge. Sarah knew it the moment she stepped down the courthouse steps. Her acquittal was not the end, it was the beginning of retaliation. She returned to Fort Gibson and resumed her life with almost suspicious normalcy. She worked as a seamstress, stitching dresses and mending uniforms. She attended the AIM church every Sunday, singing hymns with a voice steady enough to make even the pastor lower his head in respect. She greeted neighbors politely, carried groceries in a simple cloth bag, lived in a small rented room above a dry goods store. To anyone who wanted to believe she had been humbled, subdued, or broken, she presented the perfect picture of calm domestic routine. But beneath that surface, her work deepened. She spent evenings copying letters. She spent nights meeting women who knocked quietly on her door. She trained 3 successors, Elizabeth, Ruth, and Mary, teaching them exactly how to document testimonies, how to hide records, how to verify stories so that lies could never infiltrate the archive. She drilled them on accuracy, handwriting clarity, methods to protect documents from humidity, and how to speak to a frightened woman without pushing her too hard or too fast. These weren't lessons in rebellion. They were lessons in preservation of truth, preservation of memory, preservation of dignity in a world determined to erase it. Sarah distributed pieces of her archive across multiple places: church basements, tribal council houses, private homes of sympathetic free women, even sealed boxes entrusted to Creek elders who understood the value of knowledge carried across generations. She didn't trust any single location. She trusted redundancy. If one burned, others would survive. If one was seized, others would continue the work. Sarah had no illusions about her own safety. She had lived too long under systems designed to grind women like her into dust. But she also knew something the system didn't. Knowledge, once shared, refuses to die. By 1857, word of her network had reached even the most remote corners of Indian Territory. Women who had never met Sarah, never seen her face, never stepped foot in Fort Gibson, were using techniques she had documented. They were writing letters in careful code. They were recording the behavior of overseers and masters. They were noting dates, times, injuries, excuses. They were building evidence. For the first time in generations, women who had been denied literacy, denied humanity, denied legal standing, were quietly constructing their own version of authority, truth, written in their own hands. Plantation owners, sensing something shifting beneath their feet, grew paranoid. Night patrols increased. Rules tightened. Overseers watched cabins with new suspicion. And in whispers, always in whispers, men spoke Sarah's name with the same dread usually reserved for plagues or storms. They could no longer pretend the assaults were isolated incidents. They could no longer dismiss the precision of the injuries as coincidence. Something was happening, something organized, something they didn't understand. But even as fear spread, Among the powerful, something else spread among the powerless, a spark of confidence, quiet but unshakable. Women who had lived their whole lives bracing for danger now held knowledge that made danger less inevitable. They were not invincible, they were not safe, but they were no longer helpless. And that shift, that subtle change in posture and awareness, frightened the system more than open rebellion ever could. While the men burned with anger, the law prepared its next move. The acquittals had humiliated them, the jury's statement had enraged them, and the spread of injuries had terrified them. So they chose a weapon more insidious than violence, legal suffocation. They searched her correspondence, they intercepted letters, they pressured postmasters, they questioned her friends, they examined her finances, they monitored her church attendance, they waited for anything that could be turned into a charge, and they found it, or rather, they invented it. Mail fraud, an absurd accusation, a thin charge, a technical excuse crafted for one purpose: to silence her without turning her into a martyr. They didn't want to execute her. They wanted her isolated, removed, erased from influence. And in December 1857, they arrested her again, shackled her again, and dragged her into a courtroom where the verdict felt predetermined. This trial was nothing like the others. Judge Patterson allowed no debates about self-defense, no moral arguments, no systemic criticism. He cut off her attorneys, dismissed her explanations, and told the jury the case was simple. Did she misuse the mail? Yes or no? Strategy replaced justice. Procedure replaced truth. And within 40 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Sarah did not cry. She did not collapse. She did not plead. She simply nodded, the same way she had nodded when Wickham first fell against the cabin wall, when she walked into Sheffield's courtroom, when the jury acquitted Hannah. She understood systems better than anyone in the room, and she understood what came next. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal confinement at Fort Leavenworth and ordered never to return to Oklahoma Territory again. The punishment wasn't designed to correct her. It was designed to remove her. But as they led her away, Sarah turned one last time to the gallery, filled with women who had learned from her, men who feared her, jurors who admired her courage, lawyers who respected her mind, and she said the one thing the system never wanted spoken aloud: "They can exile me. They cannot exile what I've taught." And she was right. The work had already outgrown her shadow. It lived now in the hands of hundreds. It lived in letters hidden in cedar boxes. It lived in memories carried across cabins and church pews. It lived in the minds of women who had whispered warnings in the dark for years and now finally understood the patterns behind the fear. Sarah was being sent away, but the fire she had started was already too wide to contain. Fort Leavenworth in the winter of 1858 was a place built not just to confine, but to dissolve the people inside it. Its limestone walls rose like cold jaws around the women's section, trapping damp air, echoing footsteps, and swallowing identity. Prisoners didn't enter as individuals, they entered as numbers. Rules replaced names, silence replaced conversation, routine replaced thought. The system believed it could wear people down until they became as shapeless and grey as the stone blocks around them. But when Sarah Granger arrived, shackled and thin from weeks of transport, the guard sensed instantly that this one would not dissolve the way the others did. She didn't resist, she didn't argue, she didn't bow. She simply observed quietly, carefully, the way she'd observed every environment she'd ever been forced into. And within hours of her arrival, she understood Leavenworth with the same precision she once used to map the dangers of a cabin door opening at night. The women's quarters held 17 inmates, each occupying a narrow wooden platform covered with a thin straw mattress. No privacy, no warmth, no softness. Winter seeped through the stone walls until even breath felt like a cold draft. The work assigned to the women laundry for the entire garrison destroyed hands, backs, and spirits in equal measure. Buckets of scalding water, heavy wool uniforms, soap so harsh it left burns. For most inmates, days blurred until they forgot why they were imprisoned at all. But Sarah adapted immediately. She had survived the fields of Alabama, the brutality of Oklahoma, and for trials designed to silence her. Leavenworth was harsh, but it was predictable, and predictable environments could be navigated. She studied the guards' routines, the times meals arrived, the way inmates whispered to each other when they believed they weren't being watched. She mapped every weakness in the schedule without ever lifting a weapon or breaking a rule. Other women noticed her, some cautiously, some with quiet awe. Many had heard her story, printed in scraps of newspapers or whispered through the prison grapevine. A woman who cut 3 masters, a woman who walked out of 4 trials, a woman who taught others how to fight back. Some expected her to be fearsome, loud, or hardened. Instead, she was composed, precise, gentle in a way that made even hardened prisoners listen more carefully when she spoke. She didn't talk about her past unless asked, and even then, she spoke as if describing someone else's life. "What I did," she told one inmate, a counterfeiter named Catherine, "I did because I had no other choice. That was all. No elaboration, no triumph, no guilt, just fact." And something about her tone, soft but immovable, made other women trust her instantly. Within weeks, Sarah became the quiet center of the women's unit. She didn't lead, she didn't command, she simply existed in a way that others gravitated toward. When a young inmate panicked on her first night, Sarah guided her breathing until she fell asleep. When an older woman struggled with the weight of laundry tubs, Sarah repositioned her stance to spare her back. When 2 women nearly fought over a stolen blanket, Sarah diffused the tension with a single sentence, so calm and exact that both women stepped back as if waking from a trance. What frightened the guards was not her. Defiancy never broke a rule. What frightened them was the way the unit seemed steadier, sharper, more disciplined around her. A prison's power relied on its ability to keep inmates fragmented, hopeless, and afraid. But around Sarah, the women became something else: focused, watchful, connected not by rebellion, but by dignity. She never openly taught self-defense inside Leavenworth. She didn't need to. Many inmates were not facing nightly threats like the women on plantations. What she taught instead was mental survival. "Pain is what they do to us," she said quietly during laundry shifts. "Suffering is what we decide to do with that pain." It was the kind of wisdom that stuck to the walls even after she left the room. But the harsh conditions took their toll. Months of damp stone, labor, and exposure wore down even Sarah's trained discipline. The cough started in summer, a dry rasp she ignored. By autumn, it deepened into something that shook her entire frame. The prison doctor noticed, but offered little help beyond thin broth and rest that never came. Budget constraints, he explained, regulations, procedures, words that meant the system had already decided her value. Minimal. Still, she worked. Still, she stood tall. Still, she listened to others' fears and offered clarity. She refused to let Leavenworth shape her. Instead, she shaped the small world around her, one conversation at a time. And then came the letter, smuggled through a chain of sympathetic hands. A laundress, a soldier, a guard's wife. It reached Sarah in March 1858, a coded message from her successors. "The garden you planted continues to grow." She read it silently, let out a breath that was almost a laugh, then fed the letter to the laundry stove, erasing the evidence, but carrying the meaning inside her chest like a flame against the cold. Her body weakened, but her resolve strengthened. Her work had survived its creator, and that was the one victory the system could never reverse. For the first time since her imprisonment, Sarah allowed herself to rest, not because she was defeated, but because she had built something strong enough to continue without her. By November, pneumonia tightened around her lungs. Fever blurred her vision. Yet in moments of rare clarity, she still wrote letters, final instructions to her network, messages to allies, and one note to Judge Brinridge's daughter that historians would later call one of the most important moral documents of the era. In the infirmary, surrounded by women who admired her and guards who didn't understand her, she drifted between consciousness and memory. She saw Alabama fields, Oklahoma courtrooms, the faces of women who whispered their fears into her hands. She saw the archive, her true legacy, standing solid like a building made of paper that refused to burn. And when the end approached, Sarah didn't fight it. She had already won the only war she cared about. She had broken the silence. She had taught others to see patterns. She had taught women to defend themselves in a world built to harm them. She had done what no weapon could. She had given knowledge to those denied it. Her last words, soft, fragile, nearly lost to the cold morning air, were not for the guards or the doctor. They were for the women who would carry her work forward. The work continues. And with those words, Sarah Granger passed from life into legacy, leaving behind a prison that had failed to contain what was most dangerous about her: the idea that truth, once shared, cannot be unleavened. Sarah Granger died in an unmarked grave on December 3, 1858. But the silence the authorities expected never came. Instead, her death moved outward like a stone dropped into a still ponslow at first, then widening into circles that touched every corner of the territories she once walked. Word traveled the way truth always had among women, quietly, carefully, but with a determination no law could restrain. By the time her name appeared in the territorial newspaper, reduced to 2 lines, stripped of context, intentionally minimized, hundreds already knew the truth of what had happened and what it meant. Sarah was gone, but her work, the thing they feared most, had already taken a life of its own. Plantation owners breathed relief, convinced the threat had ended, but even in their private letters they betrayed a lingering unease. They spoke of lingering agitation, of dangerous attitudes among the servants, of women who seemed suddenly less willing to endure what has always been endured. They knew something had shifted. The old silence had been broken, and once broken, silence does not return to its original shape. Meanwhile, among the women who had learned from her, grief did not create despair, it created resolve. They gathered in cabins, in church basements, under cover of night, reading aloud the copies of letters and notes Sarah had left behind. They studied her diagrams, they recited her recorded testimonies, they added their own stories to the packets, continuing the work in the same steady, meticulous rhythm she had taught them. Elizabeth, the strongest of her successors, wrote in her journal only 3 days after receiving the news, "She gave us the knowledge. Now we must give it to others," and they did. Within months, new correspondents emerged from Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Women Sarah had never met, women who had only heard rumors of her trials, began sending their own testimonies. They wrote in code, they wrote in fear, they wrote in desperation, but they wrote. The archive grew larger in the year after her death than it had in the previous 3 combined. Ironically, it was Sarah's imprisonment and death that had convinced so many that the work had to continue. The system had removed the woman, but not the threat. And the threat, they realized now, had never been Sarah herself. It had been the awakening she represented. Authorities tried to suppress the rising tide. In early 1859, they intercepted a packet of letters in Arkansas's 43 pages describing assaults, trials, and legal failures. 5 women were arrested and dragged into court, accused of conspiracy and sedition. Prosecutors blamed Sarah even in death, calling her the architect of defiance and the seed of dissidence. But the trial backfired spectacularly. Defense lawyers, realizing the opportunity before them, read the intercepted letters aloud in court. Reporters scribbled every detail. Suddenly, the system's cruelty once hidden behind plantation walls was laid bare in newspapers. From Little Rock to St. Louis, the judge could not acquit. Pressure was too great, but he issued sentences so light they shocked the prosecution, and in his final remarks, he said something that echoed the words Sarah had once spoken. If the law will not protect these women, it cannot be surprised when they learn to protect themselves. The very courts that had once tried to end her influence were now repeating her logic. As the Civil War approached, Union officers arriving in Oklahoma were stunned by what they found: a black population unusually organized, unusually literate, unusually prepared to record its claims. Major Benjamin Harris wrote in 1863 that the freed people of the territory kept documentation with a thoroughness exceeding even military record-keeping. He didn't know it, but he was witnessing the long shadow of Sarah's work archives protected in cedar trunks, church cellars, and tribal lodges for years before he arrived. Her network had become a quiet infrastructure for survival. And as for the men she had injured, Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond Deach carried the mark of her resistance differently. Wickham hid in New Orleans, keeping a newspaper clipping about her trials tucked inside his wallet until the day he died of yellow fever. Sheffield entered politics, speaking carefully coded truths about injustice he never dared name directly. And Drummond, the only one who freed her, spent his later years advocating openly for black education and legal aid. Sarah had scarred their bodies, but it was their conscience she had changed most deeply, proof that even violence in self-defense can spark moral transformation. When Sarah's grave was relocated in the 1920s during a prison expansion, the marker that replaced her burial site was generic, anonymous, and intentionally devoid of history. But the erasure didn't work. By the 1890s, historian Margaret Hutchinson had already uncovered a trunk of Sarah's letters in a Tahlequah church still wrapped in oilcloth, still intact. Hutchinson authenticated them and published a groundbreaking article in 1893. At first it caused quiet shock, then outrage, then admiration among those willing to confront the uncomfortable truth. Among white historians of the time, her work was ignored. Among black scholars and suffragists, it was treated as a revelation. Soon, Sarah's name began appearing in speeches, pamphlets, and reform journals, not as a myth, not as a symbol, but as a strategist, a recorder, a woman who understood that resistance meant little without documentation. And although many of her papers were lost to fires, floods, and deliberate destruction, enough survived to stitch together a portrait of someone remarkably ahead of her time. Her legacy was not a single act, it was a method, a system, a blueprint. She taught women who'd been treated as property how to understand the law's weaknesses, how to protect themselves within it, how to document its failures so that future generations could no longer pretend ignorance. She had fought the system not with weapons, but with pattern recognition, literacy, memory, and the system had no defense against a woman who understood it better than it understood itself. Sarah Granger died at 34 with no monument, no headstone, no ceremony, but the knowledge she forged under unimaginable pressure outlived empires, outlived states, outlived slavery itself. Her work resurfaced again and again in Reconstruction schools, in freedmen's courts, in early civil rights organizing, in the way black women documented abuse with relentless precision long before the world acknowledged the truth. History rarely remembers women like Sarah the way they deserve. Too dangerous for textbooks, too complicated for folklore, too morally disruptive for sanitized narratives. But history remembers her anyway, not because institutions preserved her name, but because the people she taught preserved her work, and in the end, that was always her plan. Her story continues because the work continues, just as she said it would.